Hi, this is Meredith Sumter. I'm the Asia Director at Eurasia Group, and I'm joined by John Lieber, who heads up our U.S. practice here. And given that this is the first week of President Trump in office, we thought we'd take a few moments to talk about some of the developments that we're seeing. So, John, it's a pretty huge week for Washington.
Yeah, new president, unconventional president, first president ever to have no military or government experience of any kind or experience in elected office. And I think that's showing a little bit in some of his early moves to, I think that part of the advantage of having electoral experience and political experience is you kind of understand how to drive an agenda, you understand the messaging that goes around it. Now, I don't question Trump's ability to message certain things that appeal to the American people, and he's done that so far, but his message has been about crowd size, and he's brought up voter fraud again, and the media takes this stuff as bait. But it's a distraction from his core message about bringing jobs back to the U.S. and focusing on putting America first and so forth, where they've done a lot of the things that you would do normally to draw attention to those things. They had a bunch of union guys in for a meeting. They had the auto manufacturers in. They had some CEOs, the business in for meetings. And this stuff should be kind of the narrative framing up the first week of the administration. But the media gets distracted by Trump's unconventional statements about the election that he just won. And it's a total distraction from what he wants to be talking about.
Well, that's true. And there are several big announcements that have come out this week. And even just today, his push to actually get started on the wall with Mexico, right? And you can see that he is trying to take steps that are in line with his America First approach. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of EOs coming out this week that underscore that message. The wall, the wall was authorized, I think, in 2006 by legislation under the Bush administration, who was trying to set the groundwork for immigration reform they wanted to do in the second half of their second term.
Oh, you're right. I mean, there has been a wall. There is a wall currently there.
Yeah, right? And it's not. It's like it's fencing and it's cameras and it's border guards and that kind of stuff. And that's what the EO is directed at kind of accelerating and expediting. But they need money. So Congress has to weigh in here, and they're going to have to appropriate the money if they ever want to get the wall built. And it's not going to be the kind of wall that Trump promised on the campaign trail, I think. I think everyone kind of recognized that a big, beautiful wall was sort of an overpromise. But, there will be probably more fencing and more stuff in place to secure the southern border. The question then is, how does he get Mexico to pay for it?
Right.
And then what else does he do in terms of immigration to crack down on illegal immigrants who are coming in here, deportation forces and stuff like that? Are we going to see that coming next? And there's a lot he can do under current law as long as he can get the money from Congress. Another EO that he signed this week, which was more purely symbolic, was a withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so obviously there's huge repercussions for the TPP withdrawal on Asia relations with the U.S. and also for China's role. So kind of what do you think about, I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of what you think about how TPP, what it means for China, what it means for Asia more broadly.
Right. Actually, it's quite interesting for a president who is supremely focused on competing with China and competing to win, walking away from something like the TPP, which is, I think, perhaps the most strategic tool that the U.S. has at its disposal to actually compete with China in a healthy way, to me is quite questionable. It leaves a vacuum for the TPP countries and the Pacific Rim economies. And this is important because whoever figures out how to lead the global economic infrastructure building for the future, and specifically for the Pacific Rim economies in the Asia-Pacific region, they're going to have a huge advantage in terms of being able to frame the parameters of how high-value investment flows and high-value trade flows will actually flow into what countries it will flow and into what industries and sectors. So walking away from that actually, in my view, undermines the U.S.'s ability to attract high-quality investment and better terms of trade for the economies that are going to move our economy, the global economy forward.
So what does that mean for China, though? How do they take advantage of this if the U.S. doesn't, if TPP is no longer there? How does Japan respond? What does China do?
Right.
What specific things can they do to now take advantage of this opportunity?
So for the other 11 TPP countries, they see the messages coming from Washington. U.S. is pulling out from TPP, and they're quite concerned about that, but they're not quite ready to let go of the TPP. This was years in the making. It's a very high-quality trade pact that would really unlock a great deal of growth and potential for these economies at a time that you have overall slowing growth, right? So on the one hand, you have sort of this hope by some countries, specifically Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, that perhaps after Trump is in office, they can talk him into the strategic aspects of the TPP, and perhaps maybe make some modifications or adjustments that would be politically feasible for Trump to agree to and push forward.
But that's ridiculous.
Well, I'm not sure. I say just wait. Good trade deals, they never really die. They just come back after several years.
Like the Doha round?
Point taken. But
I mean, TPP's dead. Like, Trump's not going to come back. Trump's not bringing it back.
TPP is looking like it's barely on life support, but I'm not ready to say it's actually dead, partly because there are several people in Trump's own administration, as you know, who are very strong proponents of TPP. So the question to watch forward over the next 12 months to 24 months is, who is he actually going to listen to when his actual, his protectionist trade policies are in place and start to actually hurt the U.S. economy? Who is going to have his ear and how is he going to respond? Now, second part of your question, John, I think was also really interesting, is like, what does this mean, U.S. walking away from TPP, what does this mean for China, right? And this is a great question. It comes at a time when Xi Jinping, the president of China, is newly confident and going out on the global stage, first at APEC last November, and then at Davos just recently, and saying, look, China is ready, China's open for business, and China is ready to help build the economic infrastructure of the future.
Which means what? What is the economic infrastructure?
Which means that if TPP is going to be set aside or killed, that China will look to influence the way that trade is done, both within the region and on the global scale. Now, what
and that's different than how the U.S. would do it?
Yes. Absolutely. So right now, China is advocating for the RCEP. So this is a trade pact that's basically Asia focused. It has ASEAN countries as its core, but it has other countries like China, India, Australia, etc. It's a trade pact, but it's a trade pact that's not going to be as impactful as a TPP, because basically it allows these countries to say that they're actually reducing tariffs on trade, but in practice, it doesn't force them to not use non-tariff barriers to block trade. So even if the RCEP comes into play, it will still allow countries like China or other countries to be able to protect their domestic industries and continue on with trade protection.
Does China have a lot of free trade agreements with other countries, bilateral or multilateral agreements?
China has a lot of, they do. They are partnered to a lot of bilateral trade agreements. They feel more comfortable in bilateral trade agreements, and they're fine with multilateral
much like
trade
Donald
agreements.
Trump.
Yes, much like Donald Trump, as long as China feels like it can still control the terms of trade to China's own benefit.
So with a Chinese trade agreement versus a U.S.-based trade agreement, so the Chinese trade agreement is more about lowering tariffs, but not about blocking non-tariff barriers, you said?
Right.
And that's kind of the case for whatever other trade agreements they have, and they can project that around Asia if that's the Chinese order.
China is more interested in free trade as long as it suits China's interests. And I think some would argue that the U.S. has a similar position as well.
Which is a reasonable position to take.
Right. But the TPP versus the RCEP would have really forced these economies to open up their markets, and it would have unleashed a higher quality of investment in trade that would have, I think, propelled the global economy forward.
Okay. And you don't think that's the case with the RCEP?
No.
You think RCEP is going to be a step back?
I think RCEP is fine. It's actually.
Is it a done deal? Like, is it a thing that they've?
No, it's been years in the making, and I don't think we're anywhere close to actually having it be resolved. But with the TPP offline, perhaps you might see some.
Does Japan want to be in it? Australia,
Japan's already in
Peru, so they all think this is a good thing to do?
Well, it's a small, so it's like a baby step,
okay.
Right? So the TPP would be, you'd have this kind of impact. With RCEP, you'd have this kind of impact, right? This is more the 21st century, innovative trade deal. This is more trade as we have known it to date. Yeah. But the other thing that came up this week actually with the first White House press briefing with Sean Spicer, of course, was comments about the South China Sea, and it's getting a lot of play in the media, right?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. So it looks like, we've had two now members of the Trump administration, Sean Spicer and Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State nominee, both comment that the Trump administration seems interested in taking a more aggressive posture towards the South China, these artificial islands in the South China Sea that the Chinese have a claim to that the Americans basically don't recognize. Is that a fair summation of where they are?
Well, the Americans don't recognize anyone's claims to these artificial islands, actually, not just China.
And so, but the Obama administration's policy was there was some tensions building, but the Obama administration was a little more hands-off. But it sounds like the Trump administration is going to be more actively involved in fighting back this Chinese claim. Is that fair?
Well, I'd say it's getting a lot of press play right now, but these are comments from a press spokesperson and also congressional testimony from the Secretary of State, or from the proposed Secretary of State before he's actually in office. We're also at a time when the National Security Council, this is sort of the node that coordinates policy, national security policy across the government, is going through an overhaul. So no one's really in place to put forth a coordinated, thought out strategic strategy for how the U.S. is going to protect its interests in the South China Sea.
And you think that's how the Chinese hear these comments as well?
I'm not so sure about that. I think that the comments are causing a high degree of concern in Beijing. And what China is trying to figure out right now is Trump playing hardball so that he can end up negotiating some sort of better deal for American companies and their access in China? Or is Trump playing hardball to constrain China and try to undermine China's rise? If it's the former, if they decide it's the former, then any sort of reaction that they have to a Trump trade policy that impacts China will be proportional and targeted to trying to shape behavior and move toward a negotiated solution. But if it's the latter and they think that Trump is just going to be hostile to China regardless, I mean, the gloves are going to come off.
So can China make concessions? Like, are there things China can do that would appease the Trump people? Is there a reasonable accommodation that can be made here? Or, because it sure looks like, if you take Peter Navarro, his trade advisor inside the White House, it sure looks like his goal is to basically eliminate the trade deficit, shut down the Chinese government's involvement in the economy, and make sure that U.S. firms are the ones dominant on the global scene, right? And that doesn't seem like there's no kind of middle ground there that they can meet in between. It just seems like they're headed for some tensions, and there's nothing the Chinese can do to back down if their goal is to eliminate the trade deficit in the U.S., right?
Look, I still think it's early days for the Trump team, and we don't really know who among his advisors will have the president's ear and will be able to shape the relationship with China. My sense is that China is trying to find areas where they can collaborate, but finding that space could be very well shrinking to the extent that they see that Trump is hostile. That will shrink very fast, and that could actually have a pretty destabilizing effect because there are a lot of shared interests that the two countries and the two economies actually have, and taking a carrots-only approach is going to have negative ramifications for U.S. jobs.
A sticks-only approach?
Companies. I'm sorry, a sticks-only approach. Thank you.
Carrots sound pretty good. So we have a question from Chris Ajimian. Sorry if I'm getting your name wrong. What do you view as more of a threat with regards to China? Political action on the South China Sea or economic recession due to the levels of Chinese public debt when factoring local government debt, which is estimated around 90% of GDP?
Right. Great question. I would say that the Chinese leaders right now are more concerned with their economy and the extent to which they're able to manage slowing growth with rising debt levels. And if that bottoms out, it's game over. With regard to the South China Sea, any sort of perceived affront by the U.S. against China in the South China Sea, it pushes buttons of national sovereignty, but it's more of an external threat versus I think the more critical threat is the domestic economy.
Oh, that's interesting because I've heard people, the China team at Eurasia, make the case that if the U.S. starts targeting issues of geopolitical importance like Taiwan or the One China policy or South China Sea, then that's going to provoke a stronger reaction. But you're arguing that the economy is actually more important to Xi right now as he heads into this transition year, and so things that undermine the economy are going to be considered more of a threat.
Yeah, but I think that both are actually true, right? So, but Xi probably calculates that he could better manage the fallout from Trump swinging at him in the South China Sea than any real domestic economic crisis at home.
How do you think they manage it? And what do you think the response is? Like, if we think about China escalating tensions with the U.S. because the U.S. is doing some things they weren't doing in the last administration, what does that look like? Are they looking at military conflict? Are you looking at cyber espionage? What kind of stuff are they going to bring to the table?
Well, China has like the U.S., China has a toolbox of formal tools that they can use to inflict economic pain on U.S. companies and U.S. firms. But I think what's more interesting is their informal domestic toolbox, right? So these are the tools that they can informally use that will hurt U.S. Companies, hurt the U.S. economy, but it's harder for the U.S. to do things like take China to the WTO, or for U.S. companies to actually seek legal recourse, which is pretty hard to do within China.
But if I'm the Trump administration, I'm going to say, look, GE and Boeing and Microsoft, look, sorry, like I know China's a big market for you, and I know it's hard to operate there, and yeah, we're making it harder for you to operate in the short term. And in the long run, we're trying to get some concessions that rebalance trade towards American companies. I mean, can't they just send that message to U.S. firms and then say, sorry guys, we're going to do whatever we want? I mean, the pain you talk about inflicting is kind of limited to some corporates who, I don't know how many of their sales are in China today, but they're getting their IP stolen. Probably most of their sales are outside of China anyway. So is it really that bad for the U.S. if China goes after these corporations?
So these corporates, they're going to make a decision based upon their business interests, right? And they're having to deal with the politics. But from their perspective, it's like, look, if you're going to squeeze our profits or revenue streams over here, and we're talking about 20% of the world's population, that's a market that they're trying to service there. At the same time that you want me to invest in more manufacturing and bringing jobs back to America,
but it's a market they're trying to service on an unlevel playing field, because not only do they not have like full market access to China, China's directly trying to create competitors that are going to put them out of business in China, right?
So I would say that there are smarter ways to go about it than just taking out a bunch of tariffs and throwing threats to national sovereignty issues at China, whether it's Taiwan or the South China Sea.
Sure.
Right? So the Trump team is trying to use a variety of tools at their disposal to shape Chinese behavior.
No doubt there may be smarter ways to go about it, and I'm
Right.
agnostic on that point. But just in terms of like what China can do to the U.S., I don't feel like the things you've outlined are going to be strong enough to cause a reaction that forces Trump to back down, right? I mean, unless there's like true cyber espionage or whatever. I mean, aren't they going to have to kind of escalate if they really want Trump to back down here? Or is that not their goal?
Their goal is to try to keep things from spiraling out of control. This is not the year that they want to have a crisis. But if you have a president who is willing to implement a bunch of various trade or other measures that it's going to undermine China's economy, that also has ramifications for the U.S. economy and the U.S. market as well. So the question is, how will the U.S. business lobby respond to this, right? And it's something that you've raised as well. Now, my question to you, John, is, does this president listen to the U.S. business lobby?
Yeah, I don't think Trump comes into office uniquely beholden to nobody. He doesn't have to worry about what the Chamber of Commerce says necessarily, but it will start to undermine his relationship with Congress, because Congress is where business interests can really have an influence felt.
Right.
Those guys know that they are, if I'm an average member of Congress from wherever Republican, I know that I'm probably going to be running for office again in 8 years, and Donald Trump is not. So I've got to kind of think kind of longer term if I want to stay in office throughout the, have a career here.
And do you think that his approach is actually going to be successful in encouraging U.S. firms to invest more here and to put more jobs here, jobs that will be meaningful not just 4 years down the road, but 10 years down the road as we're looking at globalization and automation and what that means?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a view on whether or not these tactics are successful. Certainly putting up trade barriers, if you're going to take products off the shelves and raise prices, then there's going to be some relocation of production back to the United States. Whether or not it's effective, how effective it can be, there's obviously a cost that goes along to it. I think the Trump team is kind of relying on this trade-off between domestic employment and domestic inflation, and they're willing to take the employment side. So you have a couple other questions coming in.
Sure.
So we know about the tensions. This is from Annie Reese. I hope I'm saying that correctly. We know about the tensions, but what do we think Trump and Xi Jinping have in common? Is there common ground they can find between these two leaders? When they meet in person for the first time, will they be able to strike a deal on something?
Well, I think both of them like having the persona of being a strong man, and both of them really place a high degree of value on respect. So the extent to which the two of them can find some way to have a constructive and respectful relationship will go a long way to seeing where they can actually find some common ground. Now look, it's going to be pretty rough waters for the first year, maybe even the first 2 years of a Trump administration. He is different. He is unorthodox in comparison to past administrations that we've had that have managed the U.S.-China relationship as China has risen in relative power. So if you look at the Reagan years, you look at the Clinton years, both presidents came out swinging hard in the first 2 years and to try to shape Chinese behavior. And they concluded that using a sticks-only approach was not really conducive to success. And so they found a carrot and sticks approach, which President Obama has continued.
That's interesting. Do you think there's similar kind of levels of it, like who in the Reagan administration was pushing that? Like who do you think in the Trump administration is going to be the one that figures that out?
Right. So I would say, watch closely Rex Tillerson. Despite the comments on the South China Sea, He's someone who's a realist, he's a pragmatist, and he understands that you need to have constructive relations with China because our economies are so interdependent. I'd also say look for the Defense Secretary, Mattis, because when it comes to making assertions about what the U.S. is going to do vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea, the risk there is that you're signaling a willingness to move towards conflict and confrontation. And that's something that we've seen come out of other advisors, but we haven't yet seen Mattis come out and with his view of what a strategic, long-term viable strategy would be to secure U.S. interest in that area.
So let's take one more question from the crowd here. Barry Jason Schneider. Is it in the national interest to strengthen Russia and weaken China? And how can weakening China backfire?
Well, what do you think about Russia?
I definitely don't think it's in the national interest to strengthen Russia because we know that their economy is, they're a petro state, their economy is not super diversified, and their interest seems to be in exerting their influence around Eastern Europe and Western Europe and undermining the U.S., right? So I don't see how strengthening Russia helps us in any way. Weakening China probably helps us maybe a little bit because it allows, if you believe this narrative about domestic employment leaving to go overseas, then maybe it helps to bring us back. But the fact is, Chinese production has brought American consumers things they couldn't afford otherwise, like iPhones. I mean, one estimate is that the domestically produced iPhone would cost over $2,000, whereas one that produced in China, still expensive at $700, is a lot cheaper. The product probably wouldn't even exist without Chinese production. So, I don't know if there's any, I don't know if long run what the benefit of weakening China is. It seems like the traditional view of American leaders has been to have, it's good to have strong democracies all over the world who are our trading partners. I'm not sure China certainly doesn't qualify. Neither China nor Russia qualifies as a strong democracy today.
No, certainly not. But democracies aside, if we have a weak China that's at risk of being destabilized, that has massive ramifications for the U.S. economy and for Asian economies and the global economy as well. So you have to be very careful when you think about weakening China. I think what would be much more constructive is how do you find the right mix of policy tools to get China to create a more level playing field for foreign companies in their market? And maybe what that looks like, John, and welcome your thoughts on this, is more of a really moving back towards the reciprocity approach. Like, look, there's a lot of Chinese companies that want to invest in the U.S. and want access to our market as well. So that's all fine and good, but perhaps one thing that the Trump administration could look at rather than just starting a trade war would be to say, look, China, let's negotiate market access. This is what the experience of foreign firms or U.S. firms is in China. This is a much more open experience for Chinese firms in the U.S. And if you want to continue to have access to our market, you're going to have to make some changes back in your own home, right? We saw the Obama administration make that move a couple of times in very selective cases, and it was actually quite effective, but we haven't yet seen sort of a broad approach to trying to renegotiate the way that business gets done in China.
But that's the goal. I mean, that's where they're headed, right? That's why they're not just trying to hurt China because they want to hurt China. They want to hurt China so they can get better access for U.S. firms, isn't it?
My sense is that you're talking, and you talk with these guys as well. The view is that the U.S. has been losing a trade competition with China.
A one-sided trade war.
A one-sided trade war. And that the U.S. needs to compete to win and to win against China. I think a much more constructive way to approach this is the U.S. needs to compete to win, but there is also sort of a win-win. You don't want China's economy to go down the tubes. You want a strong, stable China whose behavior is shaped in a way that is in the U.S. interest and the broader global interest as well.
Okay. One more question from Dan Jensen. What are the implications of Trump abandoning or flirting with abandoning the one China policy?
Yeah. This is a big question. I think there are proponents that say that, look, the last 40 years of U.S.-China, U.S.-Taiwan relations hasn't really done much for Taiwan. But my read of the situation is, it's before you throw out a diplomatic principle that has kept the peace among these three entities for the last 40 years, you better have a pretty good sense of what the end game is going to be. And some of the statements coming from President Trump or the administration have been akin to, well, we're questioning the one China policy vis-a-vis China and Taiwan to see if we can strike a better deal for U.S. firms in China. So what that actually does is it signals that you're willing to negotiate away support for the democratic government on the island of Taiwan, if that means that you have better access for U.S. firms, I actually think that that will backfire both on the principle of negotiating away a support for a self-governed entity and democratic principles there, but also China is unlikely to respond favorably to that. They're actually, by Trump sort of swiping at what they view as a very, very sensitive issue of national sovereignty, my sense is that rather than acquiesce and give Trump a better deal, they're going to find some way to exert considerable pressure on U.S. firms.
What does that mean?
That restricting their ability to operate within China.
So a lot of what you've talked about is kind of economic pressure on the U.S. Do you think there's any possibility China's moves up the stakes to diplomatic or military pressure?
I would think that they would want to avoid the military card as much as they possibly can.
Mm-hmm. So doesn't that give Trump a pretty strong hand to kind of, provoke them? He obviously doesn't want to provoke military action, but if he knows that if he says, "Sorry, U.S. firms, it's going to get the operating environment for China is going to get bad, going to get better, going to get worse before it gets better," and he knows China doesn't want to play a military card, then can't he kind of push them pretty far? Doesn't he have a lot of leeway and a lot of leverage to achieve his goals?
Both sides think that they have a lot of leeway and a lot of leverage to achieve their goals, and I think that's the danger point here, that we're playing with fire, and these are not very carefully thought out policies that I've seen to date. It's just more along the lines of, let's just try different things to try to pressure China and to hit at China without really thinking through, like, what does this mean for Taiwan? And if your end goal is to negotiate a better commercial or trade or economic environment so that U.S. companies and U.S. workers can prosper, then going through a very painful and contracted trade or economic war is not one way that I would suggest doing it.
Meredith, I feel like you're not a huge fan of the Trump administration's China policy. Is that fair?
No, I would say that, look, the American people voted a president into office, and a lot of his supporters came from non-urban areas that feel like they do not have a viable future in a globalized economy, and they're concerned, and they've seen their jobs disappear, and the traditional politician has not, in their view, delivered in terms of changing their environment and changing their fate and fortunes. And so he's speaking to them, he's thinking about them, and I think that's something that all Americans and all politicians should also be focused on. The question comes as to style, approach, or tactics. We are in a globalized economy. This is a globalized world, and that's not changing. So if you're going to take a more mercantilist approach or protectionist approach, my question is, what is then going to happen to American industry and American economy when we have fewer profitable trade relationships and fewer connections to the global economy? Can we self-sustain that? And I'm just not sure that we can.
Cool. Well, thank you all for joining us today. John Lieber, Meredith Sumter with Eurasia Group. We'll be back again someday soon to talk more U.S.-China policy. Thanks.